Good morning, everyone. My name is James Harper. I'm a PhD candidate here at CU Boulder, and today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my research into household preferences for rural fecal sludge management services. Before I dive in, I want to acknowledge my two primary research partners, IDE, who were integral to the entire study, however, specifically the survey instrument design, as well as all of the data collection, and Katie Dickinson of CU Denver, who was very important in the study design as well as the analysis of the data for this study. So first off, a little bit of background. Around the world, there are approximately 3.4 billion people using latrines in rural areas every day. And these latrines rely on something called fecal sludge management. The latrines provide the first two steps, capture and containment, and the remainder of the process, the emptying, transport, treatment, and safe reuse or disposal of the fecal sludge contained within those latrines, is typically pretty difficult to achieve in a rural context. So generally speaking, rural FSM is typically unsafe. We frequently encounter households emptying their own pits without protective gear. For example, here's a homeowner in rural Cambodia that has rigged up a bucket on a rope. He goes in and empties out a small portion of the fecal sludge stored within his latrine pit, moves it away from the pit to dispose of it into the environment. And you'll notice in the picture here, it's a little hard to see, but he's not wearing shoes, just as an example of lack of protective gear. Rural FSM typically does not provide treatment for fecal sludge, and fecal sludge is typically disposed directly into the environment without a lot of consideration as to where or who's downstream, those kinds of issues. So to achieve safe fecal sludge management in a rural context is really going to require trained individuals and ideally a paid professional service. And this is primarily because latrines typically require maintenance every 2 to 5 years, and that all-important regulation of what practices are being performed is going to be much easier to achieve when you're regulating professional services as opposed to every single household with a latrine. So our study looked specifically at FSM services, and there are two general types of FSM services. There are services that provide the rest of that FSM chain, that empty, transport, treatment, disposal, reuse of fecal sludge, or a service could install a new pit. So for example, with a single pit system, they could install a new pit and then move the latrine to that new pit, keeping a single pit system, or they could add a new pit to an existing single pit system, creating a dual pit in series or a dual pit in parallel system. Now, there are many methods possible to achieve either of these pathways of service. In terms of emptying, you could empty manually, you could empty with a submersible pump, or you can empty with a vacuum truck. And there are lots of different options available to FSM service providers. Now, the market that supports these FSM services and the methods that they use is going to strongly depend on how a household, or households in general, value those services. So for example, households might prefer having a vacuum truck come to their household, but might not be able to pay for it. So they may not value it enough to justify an FSM service providing that particular method. So understanding this valuation that households have for services is really important to establish this FSM service market. And that motivates our research questions. Firstly, which attributes of FSM services do rural households prefer? And more importantly, what are they willing to pay for them? So our study was conducted in Cambodia, a small country in Southeast Asia that's bordered by Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. You can see it there in the bottom right of the map. Now, Cambodia is a lower middle income country whose population is approximately 80% rural, and that rural population relies on latrines for their sanitation systems. Our study design uses a cluster randomized sampling technique. The study was implemented across 5 provinces, and in each district of those provinces, we visited 5 villages, and in each village, we surveyed 6 households. This gave our study a detection threshold of approximately 8.2%. And households that had owned a portaflex latrine for more than 2 years were included in our study. And these households were likely in that mindset of, yeah, I'm probably gonna need to maintain my latrine sometime soon, so they're probably starting to think about fecal sludge management or have dealt with it in the recent past. Now, we used IDE's sales database in order to implement this sampling frame because it would have been really difficult to achieve this particular sampling frame otherwise. For this study, we created something called the FSM survey that looked at household decision-making in a lot of different aspects of fecal sludge management in the rural context. And one aspect of that survey is the discrete choice experiment that I'm going to tell you about today. So first off, what is a discrete choice experiment? Well, it's the gold standard in assessing the preference for multiple attributes, and specifically the stated preferences. So that is what people say they prefer, option A or option B, when comparing two different things. And from this data, we can calculate what's called the willingness to pay for different FSM service attributes for this study. Now, we decided to describe FSM service attributes using 5 different attributes. And here are those 5 attributes in each row shown in this table. You can see the first is, does the service prevent contact with fecal sludge for everyone? And everyone was described to be the household members, the pit emptier themselves, or the service provider themselves, community members, and people downstream after fecal sludge is disposed. Second, can the fecal sludge fertilize crops after emptying? Third, how disgusting is the smell produced by the service? Fourth, how many days pass between service request and service delivery? And lastly, what is the cost of the service? All of these attributes were selected based on the literature. These are what, this is what the literature has shown rural Cambodians to care about primarily with their sanitation systems. So that's what we decided to actually put some numbers to with our discrete choice experiment. You'll notice that each attribute has different levels. So for example, a service could prevent contact with fecal sludge or not. It could be produce a not disgusting smell, a slightly disgusting smell, or a very disgusting smell. And the services could range in cost from 50,000 rial up to 250,000 rial. And just for your own reference, that's approximately $12 US up to about $63 US. And you'll also notice that each level of the attribute has a visual indicator that goes along with the text indicator. And this is to mitigate any issues of literacy in our respondent pool. So each household was asked 5 questions, and each question looked like this. You'll see those same 5 attributes in those 5 rows describing option A and B. And the household was asked to select which of these 3 options, A, B, or C, do you prefer? So you'll notice that options A and B are described by those attributes with different levels, and those levels varied by question based on what's called a blocked fractional factorial design, which is a fancy way of saying that we ask very specific questions in order to answer our specific research questions. Now you'll notice that option C is not described by those 5 attributes, and this is what is called the neither option. This is what households would choose if they didn't like either option A or B. And we're calling this also our non-service option. Prior to the start of the discrete choice experiment, households were asked in the broader survey, what would you do if no FSM service were available? And their answer to this question informed the option C for their specific household. So option C could be empty your own pit, open your pit during flooding, use your neighbor's latrine, or revert to open defecation. So that option C was specific to each household and basically allowed them to say, hey, I don't really care for option A or option B, those services. I'd rather do what I would do if no service were available. So in terms of data collection, we trained 21 enumerators to administer the discrete choice experiment. We started by creating some video tutorials that walked through more or less what I just did with you guys about how to discuss the attributes and the different levels to the households and explain some of the intricacies of those levels and attributes. I created a few video tutorials for that purpose. And then IDE enumerators started doing role playing after the training sessions so that they could understand their perspective as being the enumerator as well as the household's perspective. And then they actually went out into the field, into a trial village that was not included in the final study, in order to hone how they explain things and to also measure and gauge the intelligibility of the discrete choice questions. Based on those experiences, we made a few minor changes to the discrete choice experiment in terms of wording and some of the visual indicators in order to make sure that everything was being communicated clearly. So in terms of actual data collection, we were able to survey 1,461 rural households, each of which was asked 5 questions. And the surveys were performed in the households themselves, as you can see here, primarily to make the respondents more comfortable in answering these questions, and also to get a lot of other questions outside of the discrete choice experiment answered for that broader FSM survey. So before I dive into results, I want to briefly touch on theory and analysis methods. Discrete choice experiments are based on something called a random utility model, which is a relatively simple model, but does have a lot of variables there. In short, this model describes how the utility or usefulness of an FSM service to a specific household is a function of two things. It's a function of what are called the marginal utilities of the service attributes. That's basically how useful each different attribute of a specific service is to that specific household. And then the second part is an error from an unobserved service, from unobserved service attributes. So as I mentioned, we're only describing 5 different attributes of these services, and there's obviously a lot more things that people think about and also describe services in general, so that's an error in the model. Now, one of those attributes was cost, and that allows us to calculate the willingness to pay for those other 4 attributes that go into our analysis here. We use 3 different models that have different assumptions in order to analyze the data. First, a conditional logic model assumes that all respondents, those 1,461 households, have the same preferences, which is obviously a pretty big simplification. Second, increasing in complexity, moving to a mixed logic model, assumes that respondent preferences vary according to a normal distribution. So each preference, each coefficient in the model has a mean and standard deviation associated with it. And then lastly, the most complex model is a latent class logic model that assumes that there are certain specific number of subgroups within the population, and the people within those subgroups all have the same preferences. And this is most likely the most accurate going forward. However, in this presentation, I'm just going to present the mixed logic model results for clarity and simplification there. So in terms of the result, I want to walk through this figure and then we'll start talking some details. So on the left, on the vertical axis, you have the model coefficient. Higher indicates a more preference for each of the attributes that are shown across the horizontal axis. You'll see starting with preventing contact with fecal sludge, using fecal sludge as fertilizer, and then reducing smell disgust. And you'll notice that there are actually 2 bars for reducing smell disgust because we had 3 different steps in that variable. The first one moving from very disgusting to slightly disgusting, and the second from slightly to none. And then lastly, reducing the number of days until service is delivered. So first off, we came out with a very high model quality. You can see the R-squared is 0.32, which might seem very low, but this is what's called a McFadden's R-squared. And somewhere in between 0.3 and 0.4 is considered a very good model quality. So that can give us a lot of confidence in these results. You can see from the graph that the strongest preference was for preventing contact with fecal sludge. The preference for that was a little bit more than twice that of being able to use fecal sludge as fertilizer after, and then followed by reducing smell disgust. Interestingly, we didn't find any preference for faster service. That's that very small pink bar on the right side there. And you'll also note the error bars on these on the bar chart. These are significant standard deviations, and what that indicates is something called preference heterogeneity, which basically means that it's very likely that there are subgroups within the population that have specific preferences that differ from each other. So that motivates using a latent class logic model in the future to analyze this data. Now you'll also note that I'm not reporting any results on the neither option. We did find significant results for the neither option, but to be honest, we're not sure exactly what they mean yet. Because there are 4 different neither options, we're trying to figure out the best way to display the results and interpret the results. However, just to give you a feeling for that neither option, it was selected in 21% of the questions, which is quite a lot. And in those 21%, 60% of the households said that they would self-empty if they didn't have a service available. And that number matches up with a lot of the existing literature that's out there. So having kind of understood a bit about what the models are telling us, we can actually take this figure and make a very simple change to get to willingness to pay. All we have to do is modify that vertical axis. So now we're showing willingness to pay in Cambodian rial. The vertical axis ranges from 0 up to 250,000 rial, a little more than that. But these numbers really aren't easy to understand without some context. So some relevant financial numbers in rural Cambodia. Mean monthly household income of our respondents was somewhere in the neighborhood of 750,000 rial. Pit emptying tends to cost between 60 and 300,000 rial, depending on what methods are used. And a new pit tends to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 rial. So taking a look at the willingness to pay on the graph, you can see that we're getting pretty high values actually. It's really important to note that the willingness to pay that we're showing here is what households would be willing to pay extra to achieve these attributes. So consider a service that doesn't have any of these attributes. These willingness to pay values is what the models are telling us that people would be willing to pay more on top of that. So quite expensive. These high willingness to pay values, unfortunately, are somewhat common when you run discrete choice experiments and more broadly stated preference models. And it's based on what's called a bias towards participation. When presented with that question, those three different options, there's a bias towards selecting those option A or B. And I think more importantly, not really considering whether they would be actually willing to pay that cost that's associated with those two options. There are a lot of studies that show that determining willingness to pay is very difficult, and this is basically highlighting that. However, I want to emphasize that the relative preferences between these attributes are quite valid, and many studies have shown that discrete choice experiments are quite good at that. So in terms of verifying willingness to pay, we are going to likely need to run an additional study to determine what's called revealed preference, not just the stated preferences here, the revealed preferences. And that's to determine what do people actually pay. Not what do they say they're going to pay, but what do they actually pay for FSM services with these attributes. And that'll allow us to determine the market value for FSM service attributes such as this. So in summary, safe rural FSM is going to require trained service providers in order to achieve either emptying an existing pit or installing a new pit. Now, FSM service businesses are really going to need to understand household preferences in order to be successful. We've been able to identify household preferences, households to prefer mostly preventing contact with fecal sludge, being able to use that fecal sludge as fertilizer, and reducing the disgust of the service itself. And we've also shown that households are generally willing to pay for FSM services with these attributes, but how much they're willing to pay is still something that should be studied in more detail. So for future work, I'm very excited to run a latent class analysis to identify those preference classes that I talked about, as well as analyze those in either options. In terms of the practical sides of things, our study shows that we really need to continue to develop safe emptying practices that allow fecal sludge to be used as fertilizer and reduce the smell that's produced by those services. And the literature also tells us that we need to consider the business models that these practices will be implemented under. We need to make sure that they are efficient, easy to understand, and profitable over the long term, and easy to enter into as well for FSM entrepreneurs. And then lastly, we obviously need to train service providers in these business models and practices in order to actually bring this to rural households. Now, this work has been under development for many years in rural Cambodia, for example, but there's still a lot more to do in order to make it actually out into the real world. Additionally, our study tells us that we could start targeting the marketing of FSM services. So if you consider yourself to be an FSM service provider right now and think about the results of our study here, when you're coming up with a way of advertising your business, you might consider a phrase like, hire us to keep your household safe and your property fertile, or our service is fast and discreet. Based on our study, the first advertising campaign is likely to be a lot more effective than the second. And obviously, this is just an engineer's attempt at advertising. An advertising and marketing expert will be able to do a lot more with this than I would, but you can kind of see where we're heading with that. Now, additionally, we could start targeting the marketing of FSM services based on the preference classes that we will likely find with the latent class analysis, as well as coupling the information in the broader FSM survey, such as location, poverty status, education level, with those results in order to give marketing an even stronger chance. So that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.